Christopher Steele found himself at the centre of a political and media storm after the 2016 US election, when the former spy's shocking and sometimes salacious dossier was leaked. It alleged incumbent President Donald Trump had bribed Russian officials and taken part in sex parties, leaving him compromised and vulnerable to blackmail by the Kremlin. Steele was asked to compile the report by a US political consultancy working on behalf of Hillary Clinton's campaign. He says he never intended for it to be published. Trump failed in his attempts to sue Steele in both the English and US courts, but many claims in the dossier remain unsubstantiated. Trump strongly denies the allegations.
So this time, obviously very, very close election in America. What are your sources telling you about how Russia might be intervening already or might be planning to intervene?
It's much more subtle, it's much more geostrategic now. And the two things that come out in the book are the one thing that Russia has identified as a key issue in the American election is inflation. And this is something that the Russians think that they can keep up, that they can exacerbate in the West, and particularly in America, through the oil price. And they've spent the last few years growing closer to OPEC and OPEC leaders to limit production and keep inflation high in the world economy.
And you think they're already doing that, to be clear? I mean,
yes.
This is happening now.
I mean, they're sort of openly doing it, but their motivation declared is different.
And they're also, in your belief, your sources are telling you in your book, that they're in some way trying to manipulate migration at the southern border to the US. Just explain what you found out there.
So once again, they're very aware that that's a toxic issue in the election and one that they perceive as aiding Trump and not helping Kamala Harris. What we do know for sure is that in the last few years, the Russian intelligence presence in Mexico has absolutely mushroomed. There are many, many more agents operating out of Mexico City now than ever were. And looking at the border, somehow they will manipulate gangs and so on to stir up more immigration into the southern part of the US.
Which would be to Kamala Harris's detriment.
Absolutely.
Do you think still, after the murder of Alexander Litvinenko, you've had obviously the Skripal poisonings, you've had Crimea, you've had now Ukraine, do you think the West shows Putin weakness rather than strength?
Certainly the West has been weak and has lost its deterrence against Russia in the last couple of decades. And so I think Russia is really out of control at the moment, and there aren't really many ground rules as to what would constrain them or what they would stop at. And one of the things that really worries me is, you remember the prisoner swap that took place recently for Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal journalist in Russia, was swapped in return for an FSB assassin called Krasikov, who had murdered somebody on the streets of Berlin and who was returned to Russia and met off the plane, I have to say, by President Putin himself, or somebody looking like President Putin, as an endorsement and as a message really for Russia's assassins and Russia's dirty operations, that if you carry out your duty, if you carry out your work, don't worry, we will get you back, we will get you out of prison. So that again was a really big blow, I think, to deterrence in terms of these kind of kinetic, as we say, operations.
You don't think the deal should have been done?
I don't think Krasikov should have been included in the deal, no.
Trump's spokesman says that everything in your book and everything that you say should be dismissed and that you are actually meddling in his election campaign. But given we are just weeks away from polling day in America, doesn't he have a point that you're meddling?
I'm trying to set out a warning of hostile states, authoritarian states, and their meddling in the election in America. I'm an American ally, I always have been.
You suggest in your book that Trump is more dangerous than China and Iran. I mean, to compare, a past president and potentially future president of one of our biggest allies, one of the world's biggest democracies, to countries that threaten our very existence seems pretty far-fetched, to say the least, doesn't it?
I respectfully disagree with that. I think the future of NATO would be thrown into severe doubt. Article 5, which is the mutual defence agreements within NATO, I think that the prospect of Putin triumphing in Ukraine through some sort of peace deal that really wasn't worth the name, in which a lot of land was ceded to Russia, Putin was able to present that to his people as a victory, go back, rearm, and then attack somewhere else, the Baltic states in particular. And actually, if you talk to diplomats and government officials and intelligence officers from particularly Eastern European countries, you will know they're absolutely petrified of Trump coming to power. And as a secondary wave, people like Le Pen in France.
Your wife, Catherine's career working for the Foreign Office basically came to an end after the leaking of your dossier. Her boss said there was a perceived conflict of interest with your work. What do you think was going on there?
She was basically sidelined and not allowed to do a proper job and not allowed to go about her proper business as she always had been. And she was a public servant with a great record, great track record, spotless record. And effectively, she was never offered another serious job.
So they were scared of offending Trump?
Yes, essentially. And she was, in many ways, the victim of that.
And Trump still hasn't paid you what he owes you from the time you defeated him in the British courts before?
Yes, Trump probably owes us in the region of £500,000 to £1 million for 2 cases, actually, one in Florida and one here, and has been in breach of a High Court costs order in Britain now for 6 months and shows no sign of paying. So his respect for Britain and his respect for our rule of law and way of life seems to be pretty limited.
So what are you doing about trying to get that money from him?
I couldn't possibly give away all those plans, but certainly we're not giving up and we will continue going with this until the end.
Christopher Steele, thanks very much.
Thank you.
We did ask the Foreign Office for a statement, but they haven't sent us anything in response.